Okay, cool. So I think we need to be honest about where we are in education, really. Yeah, when this went live, there was some questions getting fired. How is the curriculum racist? But the reality, obviously, is that there's an endemic and all-pervasive problem with racism in Britain, and the COVID crisis is certainly exposing that. You know, you're 4 times more likely to die if you're black, twice as likely to die if you're of an Asian heritage. I mean, you know, the statistics about racism and inequality in Britain is speaking for themselves, and education is also got its real problem with racism, and this isn't down to a few bad apple teachers. I like reject that. That doesn't mean that individuals shouldn't work on their own sort of prejudice. We of course should all be doing that, but racism is something. Racism in education is something that's built into the system. It's systemic. It's institutional. And Macpherson gave us an adequate definition as to what institutional racism is. So black Caribbean pupils are permanently excluded from school at a rate of 3 times that compared to their white white colleagues. That jumps to 156 times more likely to be excluded if you're black with SEND and are on free school meals. Black, particularly Sikh and Muslim children, are more likely to be targeted for uniform and by uniform and appearance policies. There is still a black attainment gap that only grows the further you go through education. And of course, less than 10% of school teachers in the UK are black. And there's been a real concern about awarding grades this year because black children will routinely outperform in exams what their white teachers predict. Now, this doesn't mean that we hold up the exam factory as the solution, because of course it isn't. Because of institutional racism, the exam factory fails children, but we must recognize the struggle there. And of course, the curriculum, which is decided upon by parliamentarians, has got no space to celebrate black achievement, black history, black culture, or black politics. And that deprives not only black children of a relevant education, but also denies white children access to an honest, broad, and balanced education, because all children deserve to see themselves reflected in their books, in their schools, and in their communities. And to create this, to achieve that, really, we're gonna need to really create some change, because what we do have right now, and it's been mentioned before, is 1 month in October where we might have an assembly on someone black because it's Black History Month, but there's not much else beyond that. And how alienating for everybody. I mean, British politicians will still talk about, you know, they talk about children learning the role of Britain in abolishing slavery, but what is taught is not necessarily the truth. In fact, if children are taught about slavery at all, they tend to be taught the same 3 things, which is Wilberforce freed slaves. Britain was the first country to free slaves, and it did so for moral reasons, and Africans sold their own people. Now, of course, the first countries to abolish slavery was Denmark in 1792. France followed a few years later during the French Revolution. And of course, independence wasn't gifted, it was fought for. There was the Haitian Revolution, for example. The slaves emancipated themselves. And then in the case of the French-held islands, the British then sent armies to invade the French Caribbean islands to try and reinstall slavery. Their campaign was on the whole unsuccessful. They lost tens of thousands of troops. But the point I'm making is this moral abolitionist narrative that we teach in schools, or that gets taught, is nothing but a myth, really. A significant but not only reason that slavery ended was because rebel slaves fought for their freedom. And of course, that wasn't a linear process. There was some gains, there was losses. The history is complex, and it's detailed, which is an opposite to this sort of simplistic white savior narrative of William Wilberforce, the great liberator. But we also neglect the fact in teaching about slavery that there was resistance to slavery from the white working class in Britain. There were strikes against slave-produced cotton in the cotton mills of Manchester in the Northwest, for example. Now, I don't want to dwell on all this, but this idea that the ending of slavery was a top-down thing in which freedom was gifted, it's not the truth. Emancipation came from the bottom up, and class solidarity between black and white existed. In fact, educating about class solidarity, about black and white being united, is something that never features on our curriculum. And we should ask ourselves why and whose interest is that in? Why are we not the boycotts, about how white people here stood in solidarity with black people in South Africa? Why do we not teach about Jaya bin Desai and the striking Saris of Grunwick? Why do we not teach about how Jewish people and Irish people came together and kicked Oswald Mosley out of Cable Street? I mean, whose interest is it in? So the decolonising agenda for me is not only about organising for anti-racism in education, which of course is vitally important. It's not just about making sure that black history, which is working class history, is taught about with some historical accuracy. It's about making sure that there's black achievement celebrated in education, and it's not just about making sure that our schools reflect their communities that they serve, but it's about fundamentally altering the power relations in education and beyond, because education can be that tool for social change. However, right now we have this top-down curriculum that has been organised in the interest of in the interest of maintaining the economic and political status quo, and as a result, the curriculum is narrow. There's very freedom or autonomy. The accountability regime means teachers are often required to cram to protect their jobs. This means children are often taught in some transmission or inquiry-based approach, and as a result, everybody's just stuck on a hamster wheel. I think we all need to be clear as educators that we're not going to do that anymore, that there's no return into schools to do that as a to the schools that we worked in before. Freire talked about education being able to liberate or oppress, and now is the time to fight for education for liberation, because after COVID, we need to reconstruct society, and we should take this virus as an extinction warning, that if society continues on the course that it's on, the consequences do not bear thinking about. So I think we need to fight for change. It's in our power to do that. The only way we're going to create change is through anti-racist, class-conscious educators, educators that are tuned into this Zoom, for example. So I want to finish with some sort of practical things that we can all do to build for a decolonized education system. Number one on my list for me is always find space to teach critical thinking in schools. So I spent a lot of time organizing against the far right, and one thing that unites racists in my view is a lack of critical thinking skills. The most effective way to teach critical thinking I've come across is through philosophy for children. It's inquiry based and dialogic. I don't work for SAPRE, the organization that do the training. I get no commission, but I've done their training and I think it is amazing. Number two, I think we need to recognize that education is a key battleground in the fight against racism. That means we need to embed anti-racism everywhere in our schools and in our practice, and we must be explicitly anti-racist. A tool to help embed anti-racism in schools is the EU's anti-racist framework. This is something that's been introduced by Black members to give all schools and educators the confidence really to discuss racism at a school level. But we need to sort of also reclaim pedagogy, and that means we need to get involved with celebrating education and build the decolonizing education agenda. So please do that. But also we need to recognise that education is a key battleground in the class struggle, and that means that I believe, should be union reps involved in a union and building things like the 5 tests storm tonight, and organising to make sure that we don't return to school until it's absolutely safe. But together we can do that. We can build this movement for change. So yeah, just get involved. Thank you very much.